Distinctly I heard the creak of the revolving office chair as Slattin rose. Then Smith had me by the arm, and we were flying swiftly away from the door to take up our former post around the angle of the building. This gained. "He's going to his death!" rapped Smith beside me. "But Carter has a cab from the Yard waiting in the nearest rank. We shall follow him to see where he goes, for it is possible that Weymouth may have been thrown off the scent. Then, when we are sure of his destination, we can take a hand in the game. We..." The end of the sentence was lost to me, drowned in such a frightful wave of sound as I despair to describe. It began with a high, thin scream, which was choked off staccato fashion. Upon it followed a loud and dreadful cry, uttered with all the strength of Slattin's lungs. "Oh, God!" he cried, and again, "Oh, God!" This in turn merged into a sort of hysterical sobbing. I was on my feet now, and automatically making for the door. I had a vague impression of Nayland Smith's face beside me, the eyes glassy with a fearful apprehension. Then the door was flung open, and in the bright light of the hallway I saw Slattin standing, swaying, and seemingly fighting with the empty air. "What is it? For God's sake, what has happened?" reached my ears dimly, and the man Burke showed behind his master. White-faced I saw him to be, for now Smith and I were racing up the steps. Ere we could reach him, Slattin, uttering another choking cry, pitched forward and lay half across the threshold. We burst into the hall, where Burke stood with both his hands raised dazedly to his head. I could hear the sound of running feet upon the gravel, and I knew that Carter was coming to join us. Burke, a heavy man with a lowering, bulldog type of face, collapsed onto his knees beside Slattin, and began softly to laugh in little rising peals. "Drop that!" snapped Smith, and grasping him by the shoulders, he sent him spinning along the hallway, where he sank upon the bottom step of the stairs, to sit with his outstretched fingers extended before his face, and peering at us grotesquely through the crevices. There were rustlings and subdued cries from the upper part of the house. Carter came in out of the darkness, carefully stepping over the recumbent figure, and the three of us stood there in the lighted hall looking down at Slattin. "Help us move him back," directed Smith, tensely, "far enough to close the door." Between us we accomplished this, and Carter fastened the door. We were alone in the shadow of Fu-Manchu's vengeance, for as I knelt beside the body on the floor, a look and a touch sufficed to tell me that this was but clay from which the spirit had fled. Smith met my glance as I raised my head, and his teeth came together in a loud snap. The jaw muscles stood out prominently beneath the dark skin, and his face was grimly set in that odd, half despairful expression which I knew so well, but which boded so ill for whomsoever occasioned it. "Dead, Petrie? Already?" "Lightning could have done the work no better. Can I turn him over?" Smith nodded. Together we stooped and rolled the heavy body on its back. A flood of whispers came sibilantly from the stairway. Smith spun around rapidly and glared upon the group of half-dressed servants. "Return to your rooms!" he rapped, imperiously. "Let no one come into the hall without my orders." The masterful voice had its usual result. There was a hurried retreat to the upper landing. Burke, shaking like a man with an ague, sat on the lower step, pathetically drumming his palms upon his uplifted knees. "I warned him! I warned him!" he mumbled monotonously. "I warned him! Oh, I warned him!" "Stand up!" shouted Smith. "Stand up and come here!" The man, with his frightened eyes turning to right and left, and seeming to search for something in the shadows about him, advanced obediently. "Have you a flask?" demanded Smith of Carter. The detective silently administered to Burke a stiff restorative. "Now," continued Smith, "you, Petrie, will want to examine him, I suppose." He pointed to the body. "And in the meantime I have some questions to put to you, my man." He clapped his hand upon Burke's shoulder. "My God!" Burke broke out. "I was 10 yards from him when it happened." "No one is accusing you," said Smith, less harshly. "But since you were the only witness, it is by your aid that we hope to clear the matter up." Exerting a gigantic effort to regain control of himself, Burke nodded, watching my friend with a childlike eagerness. During the ensuing conversation I examined Slattin for marks of violence, and of what I found more anon. "In the first place," said Smith, "you say you warned him. When did you warn him, and of what?" "I warned him, sir, that it would come to this." "That what would come to this?" "His dealings with a Chinaman." "He had dealings with a Chinaman?" "He had accidentally met a Chinaman at an East End gaming house, a man he had known in 'Frisco, a man called Singapore Charlie." "What! Singapore Charlie?" "Yes, sir, the same man that had a dope shop 2 years ago down Radcliffe way." "There was a fire?" "But Singapore Charlie escaped, sir." And he is one of the gang?" "He is one of what we used to call in New York the Seven Group." Smith began to tug at the lobe of his left ear reflectively, as I saw out of the corner of my eye. "The Seven Group," he mused. "That is significant. I always suspected that Dr. Fu-manchu and the notorious Seven Group were one and the same. Go on, Burke." "Well, sir," the man continued, more calmly, "the lieutenant..." "The lieutenant..." began Smith. Then: "Oh, of course! Slattin used to be a police lieutenant." "Well, sir, Mr. Slattin, had a sort of hold on this Singapore Charlie, and 2 years ago, when he first met him, he thought that with his aid he was going to pull off the biggest thing of his life. Forestall me, in fact." "Yes, sir, but you got in first, with a big raid, and spoiled it." Smith nodded grimly, glancing at the Scotland Yard man, who returned his nod with equal grimness. "A couple of months ago," resumed Burke, "he met Charlie again down East, and the Chinaman introduced him to a girl, some sort of an Egyptian girl." "Go on," snapped Smith. "I know her." "He saw her a good many times, and she came here once or twice. She made out that she and Singapore Charlie were prepared to give away the boss of the Yellow Gang. For a price, of course." "I suppose so," said Burke, "but I don't know. I only know that I warned him." "Humph!" muttered Smith. "And now, what took place tonight?" "He had an appointment here with a girl," began Burke. "I know all that," interrupted Smith. "I merely want to know what took place after the telephone call." "Well, he told me to wait up, and I was dozing in the next room to the study the dining room when the 'phone bell aroused me. I heard the lieutenant, Mr. Slattin, coming out, and I ran out, too, but only in time to see him taking his hat from the rack." "But he wears no hat." "He never got it off the peg. Just as he reached up to take it, he gave the most frightful scream, and turned around like lightning, as though someone had attacked him from behind." "There was no one else in the hall?" "No one at all. I was standing down there outside the dining room, just by the stairs, but he didn't turn in my direction. He turned and looked right behind him, where there was no one nothing. His cries were frightful." Burke's voice broke, and he shuddered feverishly. "Then he made a rush for the front door. It seemed as though he had not seen me. He stood there screaming, but before I could reach him, he fell." Nayland Smith fixed a piercing gaze upon Burke. "Is that all you know?" he demanded slowly. "As God is my judge, sir, that's all I know and all I saw. There was no living thing near him when he met his death." "We shall see," muttered Smith. He turned to me. "What killed him?" he asked shortly. "Apparently a minute wound on the left wrist," I replied, and stooping, I raised the already cold hand in mine. A tiny inflamed wound showed on the wrist, and a certain puffiness was becoming observable in the injured hand and arm. Smith bent down and drew a quick, sibilant breath. "You know what this is, Petrie?" he cried. "Certainly. It was too late to employ a ligature, and useless to inject ammonia. Death was practically instantaneous. His heart..." There came a loud knocking and ringing. "Carter!" cried Smith, turning to the detective. "Open that door to no one no one! Explain who I am." "But if it is the Inspector..." "I said, open the door to no one!" snapped Smith. "Burke, stand exactly where you are. Carter, you can speak to whoever knocks through the letter box. Petrie, don't move for your life. It may be here in the hallway." Chapter 8. Recording by Elaine Tweddle, Stirling, Ontario.